My name is Lovra Bennett, and for the past 8 years, I devoted my life to Barton Enterprises, a real estate powerhouse dominating the skylines of New York City. I wasn't just another employee, I was Richard Barton's right hand. I'd helped close deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, negotiated with mayors, governors, and billionaires, and fought tooth and nail to keep this company afloat during the last recession. The Barton Enterprises headquarters sat on Fifth Avenue, its glass facade gleaming like a crown jewel among the towers. Every morning I would pass through the marble lobby, my heels clicking against the floor, greeted by the familiar scent of fresh coffee from the cafe in the corner. I knew everyone from the interns hustling with their coffee cups to the senior partners who shook my hand with respect. It wasn't just a job, it was my domain. But that morning felt off. The air in the building seemed heavier, the chatter of employees was quieter, guarded. I learned why the moment I reached the top floor. Richard Barton, my boss and the founder of the empire, was out of the country, closing a £50 million hotel acquisition in London. In his absence, he'd left the reins to his son, Ethan Barton. Ethan, at 28, was everything his father wasn't. Spoiled, entitled, and arrogant beyond measure. He'd never earned a position in the company. His father had handed him cushy roles that he either ignored or destroyed. I'd dealt with his tantrums before, but always as a nuisance, something to handle while Richard managed the real work. That morning, Ethan summoned the senior staff to the boardroom. His tone on the email short clipped already reeked of something unpleasant. When I stepped inside, he was leaning back in his father's leather chair, one ankle resting over his knee like he owned the room. A few of the directors exchanged wary glances with me, as if sensing the storm coming.
He picked up my file from the stack in front of him, flipping through the pages with lazy disdain.
Lovra Bennett, he said, stretching my name out like it was a bad taste in his mouth. My dad only hires useless people. And from the looks of this, you're Exhibit A, get out. For a moment the room was silent. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. My heart thudded not from fear but from a sharp rising fury that made my pulse hot in my ears. I stared at him, steady and cold. You'll regret this, Ethan. The corners of his mouth twisted into a smirk. Oh, I'm sure I will, he said mockingly, then pushed back his chair and walked toward me. He was taller, but I didn't flinch. He stopped close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive but shallow like him. Then, with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced consequences in his life, he raised his hand and slapped me. A sound cracked through the boardroom. My cheeks stung instantly, but I didn't lift my hand to touch it. Gasps filled the air. One of the directors muttered under his breath. Ethan wasn't done.
He stepped back, looked me over, and with a dismissive kick, sent my chair skidding back. Useless and mouthy.
Security, get her out. Two guards hesitated at the door. They knew me. They knew my history here. But Ethan's glare was the kind that dared anyone to defy him. I didn't fight them. I didn't shout. I just gathered my bag, lifted my chin, and walked out as if I still owned the place. The humiliation didn't hit me until I stepped onto Fifth Avenue, the rush of taxis and honking horns blurring into background noise. I had just been publicly fired and physically assaulted in the very building where I had built my reputation. Every instinct in me screamed to march back in there and tear him apart. But no, Ethan didn't deserve an explosion. He deserved something quieter, sharper, more permanent. By the time I reached my Victorian-style townhouse in Brooklyn, the news had already traveled. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing, texts from colleagues, voicemails from friends, even one missed call from my attorney, Diana Hughes. I ignored them all, tossing my phone on the counter and heading straight to the mirror in my hallway. The red mark on my cheek glared back at me. It wasn't just a physical bruise, it was a brand. Ethan had done more than fire me. He'd declared war. My reflection didn't show defeat. It showed something far more dangerous, calm, controlled rage. I poured myself a glass of bourbon neat and sank into the leather armchair by the fireplace. Outside, the city buzzed like it always did, indifferent to personal tragedies. But I wasn't thinking about tragedy. I was thinking about opportunity. You see, Ethan didn't know who I really was. He saw me as his father's overpaid assistant, the woman who fetched coffee and smoothed over meetings. What he didn't know was that I was one of the largest private shareholders in Barton Enterprises. I'd earned those shares when I helped Richard secure a $120 million refinancing deal that saved the company years ago. My position wasn't a gift, it was a seat at the table, one I'd kept quiet about because power is stronger when it's hidden. Now, Ethan had made a fatal mistake. He'd insulted me in public, assaulted me in front of witnesses, and handed me a perfect excuse to destroy him without a single punch thrown. Revenge isn't about making someone hurt, it's about making them wish they'd never crossed you. I took another slow sip of bourbon, the burn in my throat matching the heat in my cheek. My mind began lining up the pieces, my contacts on the board, the shareholders who already disliked Ethan, the leverage I could build from his stupidity. And then the final blow, Richard Barton's reaction. When he found out his only son had just tried to humiliate the very person who had the power to remove him. This wouldn't be over in a week. It wouldn't be over in a month. It would be a chess game, every move calculated, every counter measured. Ethan might have fired me, but I was about to fire him from his position, his pride, and maybe even his own family's company. By midnight, the bourbon was gone, and so was any trace of shock. All that remained was resolve. Ethan thought he'd seen aggression when he slapped me. He had no idea what real aggression looked like. And I was going to make sure the next time he saw me, it would be at the moment he lost everything. 2 days passed, and I didn't step foot outside my Brooklyn townhouse. My days were spent plotting. My nights were spent replaying Ethan's slap in my mind, every detail, every smug twitch of his mouth like a film reel I intended to burn into ash. I wasn't hiding, I was sharpening. On the morning of the second day, I was in my kitchen, sipping coffee from my favorite porcelain mug, the one Richard had given me after we closed the $250 million Hudson Towers deal, when my phone buzzed. The caller ID lit up with a name I knew all too well, Richard Barton. I answered, keeping my tone neutral. Richard. His voice was different, lower, tighter, and edged with something cold. Lavra, I heard Ethan fired you. Did he hit you? Yes, I said, without hesitation. In front of your senior staff. No one moved to stop him. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then I heard it, a subtle shift in his breathing. When Richard spoke again, his voice carried an iciness that could have frozen steel. Didn't he know who you were? Apparently not. Ethan didn't know that I wasn't merely his father's assistant. He didn't know that I was the largest private shareholder in Barton Enterprises, holding 32% of the company. 5 years ago, when Richard was one signature away from bankruptcy, I'd stepped in with my personal fortune, securing emergency capital and restructuring the board. In exchange, Richard had given me those shares not as a favor, but because I'd earned them. I'd saved his empire. Richard let out a sharp exhale. Stay by your phone, I'll handle this. When Richard Barton said he would handle something, it was never subtle. An hour later, my sources in the company started feeding me details. Ethan had been summoned to the top floor, into the office that was Richard's domain. The building's walls must have trembled under what followed. The conversation wasn't private for long. Voices like Richard's were impossible to contain. Through the grapevine, I learned exactly what he'd said. You fired Lavra Bennett. You laid hands on her. You've just jeopardized everything this company stands for. I could picture Ethan in that moment, his cocky posture melting into a slump, his smug grin twisting into panic. He would have stammered, trying to defend himself, but Richard wasn't a man who tolerated excuses. Especially not when the target of Ethan's arrogance was the woman who could, with one motion, call an emergency shareholder meeting and strip the Barton family of control. By late afternoon, I was sprawled on my sofa, flipping through a binder of shareholder records, when my phone rang again. This time, it was Ethan. I didn't answer right away. I let it ring twice more before picking up. Lavra, please, he began, his voice trembling, stripped of its earlier venom. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Can we meet? His words were a bitter delight to my ears. I smiled not out of kindness, but out of satisfaction. Ethan Barton, the golden boy who thought himself untouchable, was now begging for an audience. No, I said simply, and hung up. That single word would haunt him more than any shouted insult could have. But I wasn't going to leave it there. Revenge is best served cold, yes, but it also tastes better when garnished with fear. I wanted Ethan to feel the ground under him crumble a little more each day. I wanted him to know that I was moving in the shadows, building something he couldn't stop. That night I drafted a list. The first name was Diana Hughes, my lure and longtime confidant. She knew every clause, every loophole in Barton Enterprises' corporate bylaws. If I was going to take Ethan down, it would be with precision legal, financial, and public. The second name was Samuel Gray, an old contact in the press. Samuel owed me more than a few favors from years ago when I'd handed him the exclusive on the Midtown redevelopment scandal. If whispers of Ethan's assault ever reached him, I knew the headlines would bleed red ink across the business pages. The third name was Marcus Lee, a hedge fund manager and shareholder with a long-standing hatred for Ethan's reckless spending. Marcus had influence among several smaller shareholders, people I could sway with the right incentive. I closed the notebook and stared at the names. Each one was a weapon. Each one was a move on the board. The next morning, I made my first call. "Diana," I said when she answered, "I want a full analysis of Barton Enterprises, voting structure and a projection of how much it would cost me to gain majority control." She didn't ask why. She knew me well enough to understand. This wasn't a hypothetical. This was an operation. By noon, she had an initial figure. It was a large number, even for me, but money wasn't the obstacle here. Timing was. To dismantle Ethan's grip, I needed to chip away at his alliances before he could rebuild them. That meant strategic conversations, subtle nudges, and the occasional well-placed rumor. Meanwhile, Ethan kept calling, 4 times that day. Each time, I let it go to voicemail. The messages ranged from frantic apologies to pathetic offers of making it right. What he didn't realize was that there was no making it right. The moment his hand had struck my face, he had written the ending of his own career. That evening, I sat by the window of my townhouse, looking out over the streetlights flickering on. The bourbon in my glass caught the glow, golden and sharp. In my mind, I could see Ethan pacing in his penthouse, checking his phone, waiting for a response that would never come. He was learning what it felt like to be powerless. The aggression in me didn't simmer, it burned hotter. I wasn't just planning to put Ethan back in his place. I was planning to remove his place entirely. As the night deepened, I picked up my phone and sent a single text to Richard. "When this is over, your son will never sit in that office again." I knew Richard would read it and say nothing. He wouldn't try to stop me. Because deep down he knew Ethan had made an enemy out of the wrong woman. And I intended to make sure the entire city of New York knew it too. The game had begun. And I was going to win. When I finally agreed to meet Ethan, it wasn't because I wanted to hear his apology. It was because I wanted him to see the trap snapping shut. I chose the location carefully, the Westin Times Square, a place where the high ceilings and muted lighting made every conversation feel heavy with consequence. The kind of place where power changes hands without a single drop of blood. I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of politeness, but because I wanted him to walk in and see me already there, composed, confident, and untouchable. My lawyer, Diana Hughes, sat beside me, her tailored black suit as sharp as her mind. She had a leather briefcase at her feet, though I suspected she could destroy a man like Ethan without ever opening it. When Ethan walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the smug, arrogant air who had slapped me in the boardroom. He looked pale, his $4,000 navy suit doing nothing to hide the stiffness in his shoulders. His tie was slightly askew, a small imperfection that told me everything I needed to know. He'd been pacing before this meeting, rehearsing apologies he knew I wouldn't accept. He sat down across from me, avoiding my eyes for the first few seconds. "Lavra," he began, his voice low, "I just want to—" I held up a hand, silencing him. "You want to explain. You want to apologize, but you don't want to pay for what you did." He swallowed. "I didn't mean for it to—" "You humiliated me," I cut in, my voice steady but sharp enough to slice through his excuses. "You hit me. You threw me out of my job in front of the entire senior staff. You're going to pay, Ethan, literally." I slid a thick envelope across the table.
He glanced at it, then looked at me with a flicker of defiance. "What's this supposed to be?"
"You're way out of the press. You're way out of a shareholder revolt. You're way out of complete and total humiliation. Inside was a settlement demand for $5 million, a figure Diana and I had calculated not for fairness, but for pain. It was enough to hurt him, enough to make him bleed financially, and enough to ensure he understood I wasn't bluffing. In exchange, I would keep the story out of the media and not call for an immediate shareholder vote to have him removed. His jaw tightened. For a moment, I saw the flash of pride that had driven him to slap me in the first place. $5 million? He said, his voice dripping with disbelief. That's extortion. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his with the kind of calm fury that makes men think twice. No, Ethan. Extortion would be me going to every business editor in Manhattan with the story of the Barton heir who assaults women in the boardroom. Extortion would be me handing over the security footage I know exists. This, I tapped the envelope with one manicured finger, is me being merciful. Diana sat silent beside me, her presence a wall of authority. She didn't need to speak. She only needed to be there, a reminder that this wasn't just a personal grudge, it was a legal war he couldn't win. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. He scanned the first page, his breathing shallow. Then he glanced at Diana, who simply raised an eyebrow. Whatever fight he had left drained out of him in that moment.
He signed without another word, the pen scratching against paper like the sound of chains closing around his neck.
But I wasn't finished, not even close. The settlement was just the first move. With that money, I started buying out smaller shareholders, people Ethan had alienated with his arrogance over the years. A quiet phone call here, a discreet meeting over coffee there. I didn't make threats. I didn't need to. All I had to do was remind them of his recent behavior and suggest that their shares might be safer in my hands. Within 3 weeks, my ownership jumped from 32% to 51%. I didn't just have influence anymore, I had control. I could now make decisions Ethan couldn't overrule. And every time he walked into the building, he'd have to remember that I owned the seat he sat in. The irony was delicious. The man who had fired me was now technically working for me. And he knew it. But I wanted more than control. I wanted him to feel the slow, suffocating pressure of his own downfall. I wanted every day in that office to feel like walking through a minefield, every conversation to feel like a trap. I wanted him to see my shadow in every meeting and hear my name in every whisper. One afternoon, I sent him an email short, pointed, and calculated to rattle him. Ethan, there will be a special board meeting next week. Attendance is mandatory. That was it, no explanation, no agenda. I knew the uncertainty would gnaw at him. When the day came, he walked into the boardroom to find me at the head of the table, Richard on my right, and the rest of the directors seated with papers neatly arranged in front of them.
I smiled. Good morning, Ethan. Please take a seat.
As he sat down, I could see the sweat on his forehead.
He knew I had the power to end him.
He just didn't know whether I'd do it right then or let him twist in the wind a little longer. The truth, I wasn't going to remove him that day. Not yet. Revenge isn't just about winning. It's about making them live with the knowledge that you could destroy them at any moment. So I let the meeting run long, discussing mundane topics, all while watching him squirm. And when it was over, I leaned in just enough for him to hear me and whispered, "You're on borrowed time." The look on his face was worth more than the $5 million he'd handed me. This was no longer just a power play. It was a siege, and I was prepared to starve him out, one calculated move at a time. The morning of the decisive board meeting, the city felt different. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that cuts through your coat, but inside me there was nothing but heat, pure, unrelenting determination. This was the day Ethan Barton's reign of arrogance ended. I dressed deliberately, choosing a tailored navy suit that framed my stance like armor. My heels were sharp enough to be weapons, my diamond studs just visible beneath the smooth sweep of my hair. Every detail was calculated to convey one message. I was in control, and I wasn't here to negotiate. By the time I reached the Fifth Avenue headquarters, the marble lobby buzzed with tension. News had leaked that the meeting would be eventful. Assistants scurried past, whispering my name like it was a storm on the horizon. I stepped into the private elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting not just my appearance, but the steel in my expression. The boardroom doors were already open when I arrived. Richard Barton sat at the head of the table. an unreadable expression on his face, though I detected a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. To his right sat Marcus Lee and Helen Crawford, two directors who had quietly pledged their loyalty to me over the past month. Around the table, others avoided my gaze, unsure of whether today would be bloody or merely historic. Ethan sat halfway down the table, wearing a charcoal suit and a false air of composure. His jaw was set, but the twitch in his left hand betrayed him. He didn't meet my eyes, which told me more than any speech could. He knew why we were here. I took my seat opposite Richard, resting both hands flat on the polished mahogany surface. My voice, when I began, was calm but carried the weight of a gavel. Before we proceed to the regular agenda, there is a matter that requires immediate attention. It concerns the future leadership of Barton Enterprises. The air shifted instantly, like the collective intake of breath before a gunshot. Ethan tried to speak first. If this is about the past month. I cut him off without raising my voice. It's about the past month, the past year, and the future of this company. Effective immediately, Ethan Barton is relieved of all duties.
He will vacate his office today. Gasps rippled through the room.
Papers rustled. Even Richard leaned back slightly, letting the moment breathe. Ethan's face went from pale to crimson in seconds. "You can't do this," he spat, the polished veneer cracking. "I'm the heir to—" "You're not the heir to anything you haven't earned," I snapped. My tone now edged with the aggression I'd kept tightly leashed for weeks. "This isn't revenge, Ethan. This is consequence. You struck me in front of witnesses. You humiliated the company in the press. And in the weeks since, you've made every effort to prove you are unfit to lead. Today, the board decides whether to save this company or let it sink with you." I let the silence hang for a moment, watching the flicker of fear creep across his face. Then I gestured to Diana Hughes, who sat in the corner with a folder of meticulously organized evidence: financial missteps, reckless expenditures, employee complaints, and the crown jewel, the security footage of that day in the boardroom. One by one, the directors reviewed the documents. Some shook their heads, others didn't look up at all. I could feel the tide shifting fully in my favor. "Let's vote," I said finally. The vote was swift, unanimous, and irreversible. Ethan's eyes darted from face to face, searching for even a shred of support. There was none. When the last vote was cast, Richard's voice sealed it. "The motion passes. Ethan, you're dismissed. It was over." But I wasn't about to let him slink away quietly. "Security," I said, my tone flat, "escort Mr. Barton from the building." The two guards who had once been ordered to remove me now stepped forward. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. Ethan stood reluctantly, glaring at me as if his stare could undo the outcome. I met his glare head-on. "Consider this your severance," I said coldly. "The fact that I'm letting you walk out the door instead of into a courtroom is more mercy than you deserve." The room stayed silent until the doors closed behind him. Then I gathered my papers, stood, and addressed the board. Barton Enterprises belongs to people who build, not people who destroy. From this day forward, we lead with strength, and we don't forget the cost of arrogance. When I left the boardroom, my heels echoed in the hallway like a victory march. Outside, the New York sunlight hit my face, bright and sharp. I didn't take a car home. I walked, letting the city's noise wash over me, the energy of millions feeding my triumph. Back at my Brooklyn townhouse, I reached for the $300 bottle of champagne I'd been saving for this very moment. The cork popped with a satisfying crack, and the golden bubbles spilled into my glass. I sat in my leather armchair, the same spot where I'd sworn I would destroy Ethan. And I smiled not out of joy, but out of deep, unshakable satisfaction. I had my company back. I had my power. And the man who once slapped me now had nothing, no title, no influence, and no way back into the world he thought he owned. In America, we say, "Don't start a war you can't win." Ethan learned that the hard way. And me? I wasn't finished. This was more than just the end of Ethan Barton. It was the beginning of a new era for Barton Enterprises, one where I sat firmly at the helm. And if anyone thought they could challenge me, they'd learn exactly what Ethan had, that I could be calm. I could be patient, but when I struck to end the game entirely.